Honors Math 2 reviewing for your final. Hey guys, how's it going? That's not working too well. I tried the introduction. So, Unit 1. If I were talking about Unit 1 primarily was on factoring. We actually had Section 2, Section 3, Section 4, Section 5, and Section 6 that dealt with 5 different ways of how to factor. And so as you think about what Unit 1 or Chapter 1 was about, factoring is the big idea. There was one section dedicated to adding, subtracting, and multiplying polynomials. There were 5 methods of factoring, and then there was one section where you had to solve and use something called the zero product property to figure out what possible solutions were. So just to lightly overview, when you add polynomials together or subtract them, you can only add, let me switch over to this red bin, you can only add 4x squared together with the 2x squared, or you can only subtract the 2x squared and the 4x squared together, the x's with x's and the coefficients with coefficients, or the numbers by themselves, the constants is what I meant to say. When you multiply, and speaking of that, I reminded you back then that you were supposed to subtract everything that was inside that parenthesis. When you multiply, you are multiplying this b to the first term and over any negatives or positives to get 2 terms there. We also introduced something called the FOIL method. FOIL stood for first, outside, inside, last. It was a way for you to distribute when you had a binomial times a binomial. The people who forget, they forget the O plus the I. Don't forget the O plus the I when you're doing FOIL, because the most common mistake that was made back in Unit 1 for foiling was that people thought you could just square the 8 and square the 3k. You cannot do that. You have to remember that it's 3k minus 8 times another 3k minus 8, and you have to FOIL this out. There is a negative 24k and another negative 24k that will combine to make that, will make 9k squared minus 24 is minus 48k plus 64. Like, that's what that expands to be. We also talked how to FOIL binomials times trinomials, and even went into a binomial times a binomial times a binomial. Not a main idea, but it's something that we did cover. Then we went into the 5 different types of factoring. If you forgot the 5 different types of factoring, the first one was called GCF factoring. It's where you pull out the greatest common factor of every single term. My recommendation to you back then was look for the largest coefficient that goes into everything and the highest common degree of variables that each term has in common. That means if you have a d to the third and a d squared, the highest degree that they have in common, they both have at least a d squared that you can pull out. The second type of factoring was something called difference of squares factoring. When you have 2 perfect squares and there's a subtraction sign, it only works for subtraction. You can add one set of your roots and subtract one set of your roots, and when you FOIL this, you'll get that. The outside is a negative AB, the inside is a positive AB. Even if you FOIL this out, the 2 middle terms cancel each other out, and that's why it always works. You can actually just take your first term, figure out what the square root is, like 6p. You can put it in front of your parentheses. You can take your second term, take the square root, and then just add one set and subtract one set of your roots, which is the easiest way to do difference of squares factoring. The third type of factoring we did in two sections. We did it in 1.4 and in 1.3. It was called the guess and check method. The guess and check method is where you guess what multiplies to be the first two terms and guess what multiplies to be the last two terms and see which one makes that O and I correct. So, for example, if I was doing the guess and check method, I would try to figure out what multiplies 3D squared, like 3D times a D is the only way to get there. What multiplies to be a 12? There's lots of different possibilities. It could be 1 times 12, 2 times 6, 3 times 4, 4 times 3, 6 times 2, or 12 times 1. Lots of different possibilities. But what you're looking for is one that has an O. Here's your F for FOIL. And O plus an I, that makes that 20D. I'm looking for a product, 3D times 1. And 12D. 3D and 12D in my head makes 15D. That's not this one. It can't be that. 6D and 6D make 12D. It's not 20. 9D and 4D would make 13. Doesn't work. 12D plus 3D is 15D. Doesn't work. 18D and 2D. Hey, I think that one's going to work. So what I would do is put the 3D and the D there. I want 18. I want the 3D to multiply by a 6. And I want the 2 to multiply by a D to be there. And then what you should always do is double check. Does this times this equal the first? Does this times this plus this times that equal that? And does this times this equal that? If it does, you've done it correct. Let me remind something to you. If you don't remember, I remember a multiple choice question being the most missed question on the Unit 1 test was because some people got an answer like, let's say, this. And the direction said, factor completely. And even though this times this and this times this foiled to be the answer, is this factored completely? No. Is there a GCF in this? Is there a greatest common factor in 2D plus 12? If there is, it means you forgot to do the GCF inside your original problem. Look to make sure that your answer is always factored completely. Sometimes you're going to have to end up, or if you made a mistake, you can pull out that 2 and you can do something like this to save what your answer could have been. Okay? Just wanted to warn you because I remember that being an issue back when we were taking the test. And if I know myself pretty well, I sometimes take some old questions that were most commonly missed and I throw them on the final. So we're talking about what I would have done 3 years ago, right? Factor by grouping was the fourth method. We've talked about GCF factoring, difference of squares, guess and check. Now we're on factor by grouping. When there are 4 terms, 1, 2, 3, 4. Factor by grouping is where you kind of did GCF factoring of the first 2 terms. You look for greatest common factor there. You look for a GCF from the 3rd term and the 4th term. And then what you were trying to do is see if these 2 groups matched. You could use that as a GCF and put the other 2 terms inside parentheses. If you foiled this out, you would find that it's still equivalent to the original quantity. Factor by grouping is where you take 4 terms, looking for GCS from the first 2, looking for GCS from the 3rd and the 4th, and making sure that they match. If they don't match, try pulling out a negative. And sometimes that helps a lot. The 5th and final way to factor was something called factoring using SOAP. It was for the sum and the difference of cubes. If you have a cube plus another cube and it was in parentheses, you could factor it using this pattern. If you had a difference, you could factor it using this pattern. The pattern was taking the cube root and the cube root, squaring it at the front of the parentheses, squaring the back one at the back, multiplying these two things for the middle, and then putting same, opposite, always positive. Those were the 5 different types of factoring that you had to know back in Unit 1. The very last section was when you factored something, how could you use it to find possible solutions? How did you do it? You actually did something called the zero product property, which says if something times something, 2 unknowns, multiply to equal 0, then either the first thing has to be 0, or the second thing has to be 0, or both of them have to be equal to 0. So this was a way for you to figure out what A could be or B could be, and we would literally take a problem. We would factor it using the sum or the difference of cubes. And then since this times this equals 0, then either the first group would have to be equal to 0, or the second group would have to be equal to 0. And we could figure out that z had to be -4 or z had to be +4 for our answer. Factoring and setting equal to 0 was the only way to find all possible solutions. And we might use guess and check, we might use GCF, you might use something else as well. So Unit 1, factoring, multiplying, and then of course solving. I can't say it. Hit like. Hey, tell me what am I supposed to say?
You gotta like, subscribe, comment on the video, and don't forget to slap the notification bell.
If you do, you might get a chance for some free extra credit.